She was 20 years old. She had $10 in the inside pocket of her pea coat, a canvas duffel bag that held everything she owned in the world, and a silver pocket watch on a leather cord around her neck that had belonged to her grandfather for 32 years before it belonged to her. She was standing on the platform of an abandoned train station in the Allegheny foothills of central Pennsylvania, and the only sound in the world was the wind coming down through the bare hardwood ridges and the faint ticking of the watch against her collarbone. She had not planned to be here. She had not planned anything, really. You do not plan when you are 20 years old and someone has locked every door of the only home you have ever known and left your belongings in a cardboard box on the front porch in the cold. You do not make plans. You move. You put one foot in front of the other, and you keep moving until you find the thing that stops you. This was the thing that had stopped her. A train station that had been closed since 1958. A building that the county had been planning to tear down in the spring. A place that nobody in the world had wanted badly enough to spend more than $10 on. She had spent $10 on it. And she did not yet know that beneath the floorboards of the small ticket booth at the far end of the waiting room, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in 65 years, something was waiting for her that would make sense of everything. The watch. The box on the porch. Her grandfather's hands. Her father's voice. The particular kind of silence that follows a door when it locks from the inside. She did not know any of that yet. She only knew the wind and the watch and the long empty rail bed running away into the trees, and the fact that for the first time in longer than she could remember, nothing was asking her to leave. Her name was Nora Callahan. She came from a family that had worked the railroads of eastern Pennsylvania for as long as the railroads had been there to work, and she had grown up understanding that this was not merely an occupation, but a kind of inheritance, a way of moving through the world that got into the blood and stayed there, the way diesel fuel stays in the creases of a man's hands, no matter how hard he scrubs. Her grandfather, Frank Callahan, had been a brakeman on the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line out of Scranton from 1949 until the line went bankrupt in 1976, and then for Conrail until he retired in 1981. He had grown up in a coal patch house in Lackawanna County, the second of 5 children, and had gone to work on the section gang at 16 because that was what a boy did when his family needed the wages, and the alternative was watching his mother go without heat in January. He had ridden the cabooses of freight trains through every kind of Pennsylvania weather for 32 years. He knew every grade and every curve and every road crossing on his division, the way other men know the layout of their own houses in the dark. He had a pocket watch, a Hamilton 992B, in a plain silver case that he had carried in the breast pocket of his denim work shirt every day of his working life. He kept it set to railroad time, accurate to within 10 seconds a year, because a railroad man who did not know the exact time was a liability to every other man on his crew. And Frank Callahan had never in his life been willing to be a liability to anyone. He told Nora when she was small enough to sit on his knee at the kitchen table in the row house in Scranton that a railroad was the most honest kind of work there was. Steel does not lie, he told her. Gravity does not lie. A train will arrive at a place at a particular time, or it will not, and there is nothing else to discuss. The world is full of people who will tell you one thing and do another, he said. But a rail is a rail, a grade is a grade. A schedule is a schedule. You can count on those things. You can build a life around things you can count on. She had not fully understood what he meant when she was small. She understood it now. Her father, Danny Callahan, had grown up at that same kitchen table, listening to his father's stories, and had told everyone who would listen that he was going to do something different with his life. Something that did not involve frostbitten hands and diesel fuel, and the particular kind of exhaustion that settles into a man's bones after 30 years of physical labor in Pennsylvania winters. He had meant it when he said it. For 2 years after high school, he had worked in the claims department of an insurance company in downtown Scranton, wearing a tie and eating lunch at a desk, and learning the vocabulary of a world that ran on paper instead of steel. He had been good at the job. His supervisor had told him he had a future there. Then, on a Monday morning in March of 1995, Danny Callahan had walked into the office, set his nameplate precisely in the center of his desk, turned around, walked back out through the glass door, and driven directly to the Conrail track maintenance yard on the south side of Scranton to apply for a position on the section crew. He told his father that night that the office had felt like wearing somebody else's coat, that no matter how long he wore it, it never fit right, never felt like his own. Frank Callahan had nodded slowly and slid his silver pocket watch across the kitchen table without a word. Danny had looked at his father. "Keep it on you," Frank said. "A railroad man should always know what time it is." Danny Callahan married a woman named Ruth Dougherty in the spring of 1998, and Nora was born the following autumn. And for the first 12 years of her life, her father came home every evening with grease on his hands and the sweet diesel smell of the rail yards in his hair, and the world was comprehensible and ordered and safe. He taught her the names of every kind of freight car: boxcars and gondolas and hoppers and tank cars and flat cars and reefers. He taught her how a switch worked, how the points moved to redirect a train from one track to another, and he explained it with the patience of a man who believed that understanding how things worked was the same as understanding how the world worked, and that this was the most valuable thing he could give her. He taught her that a railroad man's first obligation was to the people depending on him to be where he said he would be when he said he would be there. He died in March of the year Nora turned 12. A freight derailment on a cold morning in the cut north of Pittston. The incident report would later say the cause was a broken rail in a frozen tie plate. Danny had been part of the ground crew responding to the initial derailment when a second car shifted off the track above him. He had not seen it coming. No one had. Nora learned this from the two men in Conrail jackets who came to the door on a Tuesday afternoon while she was doing homework at the kitchen table. She learned it from the way her mother sat down very slowly in the kitchen chair without being asked, as if her legs had stopped working. She learned it from the sound her mother made, which was not a scream, and was not crying, and was not anything Nora had a name for a sound that she would hear in her sleep for years afterward. Frank Callahan came to the house that evening and sat at the kitchen table and did not say much because he was not a man who used words when there were no words adequate to the situation. He stayed for 3 days. He cooked eggs in the morning. He answered the phone when it rang. He sat with Ruth in the evenings when Ruth could not stand to be alone and could not stand to talk. On the 4th day, he went home to the row house. He died 14 months later. The official cause was lung cancer. He had been diagnosed 8 months before Danny's death and had told no one. Not Ruth, not Danny, certainly not Nora. He had gone to one consultation at the oncology clinic at Gasinger and had listened to everything the doctor told him, and had driven home and sat in his kitchen with a cup of coffee and considered his options for a long time. Nora did not learn the full truth of this until the evening after his funeral. She had gone to the row house with Ruth to begin the slow and terrible work of going through a dead man's belongings, and she had found in the top drawer of the dresser in Frank's bedroom a plain white envelope with her name written on it in her grandfather's careful, slanted hand. Inside was a single page, handwritten. the pen pressing hard into the paper the way Frank pressed into everything he did. It said that he had decided against treatment because the cost of the treatment would have exhausted the savings he had been setting aside for years, savings he intended to leave to her to give her a start in the world that he had not been able to give her father, because her father had been taken before there was anything to give him. He said that he was 68 years old and had lived a life that he was not ashamed of, and that trading the remainder of that life for a few additional months of hospitals and expenses had not seemed to him like a fair trade for what Nora would lose in the bargain. He said he was sorry for doing it this way. He said he hoped she would understand when she was older that some men show love by going quietly the way a train clears the line for the one coming behind it. He said the pocket watch was hers now. He said to keep it on her. Nora read the letter sitting on the edge of Frank's bed in the row house while her mother moved through the other rooms. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the inside pocket of her jacket and sat very still for a long time. She did not tell Ruth about the letter. She put the pocket watch around her neck on its leather cord that same evening, and she did not take it off again. Ruth Callahan did not handle loss well. This was not a criticism. Some people are built for grief the way certain structures are built for earthquakes, with the capacity to absorb the shock and flex and return to something like their original shape. Ruth was not built that way. She had loved Danny Callahan with the kind of absolute and total devotion that some people bring to a single relationship in their lives, a devotion that is magnificent while it lasts and catastrophic when it ends, because it has left nothing in reserve. When Danny died, Ruth did not flex. She went still. For the first year, she barely left the house. She sat in the kitchen and stared at things. She forgot to buy groceries. She forgot to call the school when Nora was sick. She forgot in the small and accumulating ways that suggested something more than ordinary grief, that other people had needs that required attending to. Nora learned to cook that year. She learned to do laundry. She learned to cash the Conrail survivor's benefit check that came on the first of every month, and to pay the utility bills with it before anything else, because the month Ruth had forgotten to pay the gas bill had been instructive in ways Nora had not enjoyed. In the second year, Ruth met a man named Gary Pruitt at a grief support group at the Lutheran Church on Wyoming Avenue. Gary was a commercial property manager from Dunmore who had lost his first wife to a stroke. He was steady and practical and wore pressed shirts and did not drink. And he looked at Ruth with the particular attention of a man who has been alone long enough to recognize what he is missing. Within 6 months, Ruth and Gary were married. Within 12 months, Gary Pruitt had moved into the row house. Within 18 months, Nora had begun to understand that she was no longer welcome in the only home she had ever known. Gary Pruitt was not violent. He was not cruel in any way that left marks or could be pointed to in a courtroom. He was cold. He was cold the way a house is cold when the furnace has been turned down deliberately, when every room is just warm enough to be technically habitable, but not warm enough for anyone to be comfortable in for long. He moved the framed photographs of Danny Callahan off the living room walls within the first month. He said it was time to redecorate. He sold Frank's old toolbox at a yard sale one Saturday morning while Nora was at school. He said it was taking up space in the garage. He had the spare room repainted while Nora was at her summer job, choosing a shade of gray that felt like an argument. Ruth stopped pushing back somewhere in the second year. Nora could not identify the exact moment it happened. It was not one moment. It was a long series of small moments, each one barely worth noting on its own, that accumulated into the understanding that her mother had made her choice, and that choice did not include Nora in any central way. Nora got a job at 16 at a diner near the old Delaware Lackawanna and Western Rail Yards on the south side of Scranton. The place was called Verna's, and it was run by a Polish-American woman named Verna Kowalczyk. who was 62 years old and had been widowed twice, once by a steel worker and once by a yard switchman, and who ran her diner the way she ran her own life, which was to say, efficiently without sentimentality, and with the firm conviction that strong coffee and the willingness to listen without interrupting were the two most important things a person could offer another person in distress. Verna Kowalczyk was a short, broad shouldered woman with silver hair, cut practically short, and hands that had spent 4 decades carrying plates and pots and had the look of it. She hired Nora for the busser shift on a Wednesday afternoon without asking a single personal question. And she did not ask a personal question for the first 6 months they worked together. But she watched. Verna was a woman who had spent 40 years watching people come through a door and understanding in the first 30 seconds of observation more about their situation than most people would learn in an hour of conversation. She watched Nora come in on the mornings after bad nights at the row house. She watched the way Nora ate when she thought nobody was looking quickly and completely the way someone eats when they are not sure when the next meal is coming. She watched the way Nora flinched slightly at sudden loud noises and the way she sat with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. Verna said nothing for 6 months. Then, one evening in December, after the last customer had gone and the door was locked and the chairs were up on the tables and Nora was mopping the floor near the back booth, Verna came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table in the back booth and sat down and said simply, "Tell me." And Nora told her. It took nearly 4 hours and a full pot of coffee and the kind of listening that is genuinely rare, the kind that does not interrupt and does not offer premature comfort and does not look for the place where the story ends so that an opinion can be inserted. Verna simply listened, and when Nora finally ran out of words, Verna was quiet for a long moment and then said, "Your grandfather used to come in here every Saturday morning for 19 years. Frank Callahan. He sat right there in the third stool from the left. Eggs over easy and rye toast and black coffee. Every Saturday from 1962 until he retired and for a few years after." Nora looked at her. "I know your father too," Verna said. "I brought a casserole to the wake." She paused and looked at the pocket watch where it rested against the front of Nora's shirt. Then she said, "This booth is yours whenever you need it." You hear me? Callahan girl, Nora had heard her. She spent the next 2 years finishing high school in the spaces between everything else. Some nights in her room at the row house, lying on the bed Gary had repainted without asking, staring at the ceiling. Some nights on the bench in the diner kitchen after Verna locked up. Some nights on a friend's couch when the friend's parents were tolerant, and the row house had become unbearable. She graduated in June and turned 18 the same week. She got a second job at a breakfast counter on Cedar Avenue and tried to save money. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone every shift, every morning, every night. She thought of it as her grandfather still walking beside her. His particular kind of silence, the kind that does not need to fill every moment with sound to be present. She tried to believe in the way that 20-year-olds try to believe things when the evidence is not cooperating, that the situation at the row house would improve, that Gary would settle, that Ruth would find her way back to something like the mother she had been before, that the particular cold that had filled that house since Gary moved in was a temporary condition and not a permanent one. She tried to believe this for nearly 2 years. She stopped believing it on a Tuesday evening in February. She had worked the closing shift at the breakfast counter. It was the kind of February night that Pennsylvania does without apology. The temperature in the single digits, the wind coming off the ridge, with the particular edge that makes it feel personal. She walked the 11 blocks back to the row house with her collar up and her hands in her pockets, and the pocket watch ticking against her throat. She saw the box on the porch from half a block away, a cardboard box, medium sized, sitting squarely in the center of the top porch step. She slowed as she approached it. Something in the arrangement of it, the deliberateness of its placement, told her, before she reached it, what she was going to find. Her clothes, her textbooks, the framed photograph of her father in his Conrail jacket that she kept on her dresser, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to Frank's mother, her winter boots, and on top of everything else, set carefully and precisely in the exact center of the box, the silver pocket watch on its leather cord. She stood looking at it for a moment. Gary had gone into her room. He had opened the dresser drawer where she kept the watch on the night she did not wear it. He had taken it out, carried it downstairs, and placed it on top of the box. This was not carelessness. A careless person would have left it in the drawer or thrown it into the box with the rest of the things. Gary Pruitt was not a careless man. He had placed it there on top where she would see it first, where she would not be able to tell herself she had been forgotten. Taped to the front door was a folded piece of lined notebook paper. The handwriting was her mother's. It said, "Nora Gary and I have decided this is the best thing for everyone. You are an adult now, and we need our own space. Please do not come back tonight or any night. Please do not call. Mom." Nora read it twice. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She tried the front door. Locked. She went around to the side door. Locked. The back door. Locked. The basement door from the alley. Locked. Every door in the house where she had grown up, every possible point of entry, locked against her on a night when the temperature was in the single digits. She stood in the alley for a moment. She did not cry. Her grandfather had not been a man who cried, and she had inherited from him something more than the watch and the slanted handwriting and the particular way of going still when the situation required stillness. She had inherited his understanding that crying was a private weather, and that the moment you were standing in the alley behind your own locked house with a box of your belongings and nowhere to go was precisely not the moment for it. She went back to the porch and picked up the box and hung the silver pocket watch back around her neck on its leather cord. Then she walked the 11 blocks to Verna's diner in the cold. Verna was still there. She was always still there after closing, doing the books at the counter with a cup of coffee and her reading glasses, a habit she had maintained for 40 years because she did not trust the numbers unless she reviewed them herself. She heard the knock and looked up and took one look at Nora's face through the glass and got up and unlocked the door and pulled her inside without a word. She looked at the cardboard box. She looked at the watch around Nora's neck. She looked at Nora's face, which was composed and still in the way that things are still when they are being held very tightly together. She turned the open sign to closed. She said, "Sit down in the back booth." She said it the way she said everything, not gently, exactly, but solidly. The way a wall is solid, the way you can lean all your weight against a wall and it does not move. She brought eggs and home fries and a mug of coffee and set them on the table and sat down across from Nora and did not say another word until Nora had eaten everything on the plate. Then she said, "Tell me." Nora told her. Verna listened to all of it. The box, the note, the doors. She did not say anything for a long moment afterward. Then she said, "You stay with me? I've got the room above the diner. It's been empty since my second husband died. It's yours." Nora tried to say something about rent. Verna said the rent is the Tuesday through Saturday morning shift, which you'd be working anyway. That's the end of the conversation. And it was. Nora lived in the small room above Verna's diner for 2 months. The room had a single window that looked out over the old rail yard to the south, and on clear mornings, she could see the light coming up over the ridge line to the east, and she would lie in the narrow bed and listen to the sounds of the diner opening below her. The clatter of Verna loading the pass through, and the particular hiss of the coffee machine warming up, and she would hold the pocket watch in her hand and feel the small mechanical pulse of it against her palm, and think about her grandfather doing the same thing on the same kind of cold morning for 32 years. Verna fed her 3 meals a day. She washed Nora's clothes in the machine in the diner basement. Every Sunday morning, there was a fresh bar of soap on the bathroom shelf, lavender, because Nora had mentioned once in passing that her grandmother had used lavender soap, and Verna had heard it and filed it away and acted on it without comment or ceremony, the way she acted on most things. It was the kindest 2 months of Nora's life. But Nora was a Callahan, which meant she had the particular inheritance of knowing when something was not sustainable. She was 20 years old, and she was living in a single room above a diner on the goodwill of a woman who owed her nothing. And, however genuinely that goodwill was offered, she could not build a life on it. A Callahan built things. A Callahan found the solid thing and stood on it and worked outward from there. She needed something solid. One evening in late March, she sat in the back booth after her shift with the old laptop Verna kept for customers and a cup of coffee going cold beside her. She had no plan. She was not searching for anything in particular. She typed cheapest property Pennsylvania into the search bar, the way a person throws a line into water when they have no expectation of catching anything just because doing something feels better than doing nothing. The results came back: foreclosures and auction listings and rural parcels in counties she had never heard of. She scrolled through them without much hope. Prices that were cheap by city standards, but not by the standards of a 20-year-old who had spent the last 2 months putting tips in a jar. Then, the fifth result: a county surplus auction page from a place called Harlan County in the Allegheny foothills north of Bedford. 11 abandoned buildings being offered for nominal fees ahead of a planned demolition program. A Grange Hall, a one-room schoolhouse, a creamery, a blacksmith shop, a dance pavilion, and near the bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, a building described as follows: former Penn Central / PRR branch line depot, Whitlock Junction abandoned 1958 roof damage to freight section, scheduled for demolition spring. Minimum bid $10. Nora sat very still. She read the listing again. A train depot, an actual train station on an actual branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The same railroad her grandfather had worked for 32 years. The same railroad that had run through the counties just south and west of Scranton in exactly the years when Frank Callahan had been riding its cabooses in every kind of Pennsylvania weather. She picked up the laptop and carried it to where Verna was wiping down the counter. Verna set down her cloth and put on her reading glasses and read the listing carefully, moving her lips slightly over the unfamiliar proper nouns, the way she did when she was reading something she intended to remember. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's the Bedford branch." She said it slowly, as if she were placing something in a room where it fit perfectly. "Your grandfather rode that line in 53 and 54, she said. He was on temporary assignment to the Bedford Division for nearly 2 years. He used to sit right there on Saturday mornings and talk about that country. The foothills, the river valleys. He talked about it like it was the most beautiful country in Pennsylvania, and he'd ridden every corner of it." She paused. "He talked about Whitlock Junction," Verna said. "He said the station agent there made the best coffee on the whole division. He used to tell that story and laugh about it, said you could stand on that platform at midnight and hear the river, but not a single other thing. Said it was the loneliest stop on the line, but the coffee made up for it. Nora's hand had moved, without her thinking about it, to the watch through the front of her sweater. Verna looked at her over the reading glasses. She said, "Callahan, girl, I think you should go look at it." Nora said, "I think I should too." Verna said, "Take the bus. I'll mark you down for 2 days off." She paused. "Take a sleeping bag." The bus from Scranton to Bedford took most of a day with 2 transfers. The last leg was a county shuttle that ran twice a week, a battered van driven by a man named Phil who talked about local weather and road conditions with the focused expertise of someone who had been driving these particular roads for 30 years. The shuttle dropped her at a crossroads in the Allegheny foothills where the road wound through narrow valleys of bare winter hardwood, and the air smelled like cold running water and wood smoke and the particular mineral cold of Pennsylvania stone. The township office was 4 miles from the crossroads. Nora walked. The pocket watch ticked against her collarbone the whole way. The road was empty. The hardwoods on either side were bare, the ridgelines showing through them like the bones of something very old and very patient. She walked with her duffel over one shoulder and her hands in her pockets and her breath making small clouds in the cold air. The Penn Forest Township office was a frame building beside a closed general store on a main street with 8 buildings on it. Inside, a woman in her mid-50s sat behind a counter with a mug of tea and a stack of property records. She had the look of someone who had been doing the same job for a long time and had made her peace with it in a way that had nothing to do with settling. Her name was Dorothea Fennick. She had been the township clerk for 19 years. She looked at Nora the way a woman looks at a young person who has come a long way on limited resources, taking in the duffel bag and the pea coat and the particular kind of road tiredness that settles in the eyes. "You hear about the depot," Dorothea said. "Yes, ma'am. You know it's been closed since '58. The freight room roof is half gone. There's no power and no water. The county's planning to demolish it in March." "Yes, ma'am. I have $10. Dorothea looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite the absence of one. She pulled a deed book from the shelf behind her and opened it to a page that appeared by the quality of its weighting to have been expecting this moment for some time. "Sign here," she said. "And here. And here." Nora signed her name in her grandfather's slanted hand. Nora Marie Callahan. Dorothea Fenwick took the $10 bill and folded it once and placed it in a metal cash box and brought a brass stamp down on the deed with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. She looked up. "It's yours," she said. "It's 1.5 miles down the old rail bed if you walk it." She paused. "My husband's got the truck out front. You want to ride railroad time?" The truck was a 1994 Ford F-150 in a shade of green that had started out darker and faded over the years to something that matched the winter fields. Dorothea's husband, a quiet man named Leonard who wore a canvas barn coat and did not feel the need to fill silence with conversation, drove Nora down a dirt road that ran parallel to the old rail bed for half a mile before turning off into a clearing in the hardwood. He stopped the truck. He pointed through the windshield without speaking. Nora looked. The depot stood at the far end of the clearing, where the rail bed widened into what had once been the Whitlock Junction passing siding. It was a single-story building of dark red board and batten siding that had faded over 60 years to the color of dried clay. A wide, overhanging eave ran the full length of the platform side, supported by wooden brackets that had gone gray with weather, but had not yet given up. A peaked shingle roof rose above it, and from the back wall, a tall brick chimney climbed into the pale winter sky with the quiet authority of something built to last. At the center of the platform side, projecting outward toward where the tracks had once been, was a small bay window, the ticket window. Behind that glass, or behind the boards that covered it now, was where the station agent had sat for 26 years, watching for incoming trains. Above the bay window, painted in faded white letters on a board that had once been dark green and was now the color of old moss, were the words she had read on the auction listing 3 days ago and had not quite believed until this moment. Whitlock, JCT Pen RR. The platform was still there, weathered boards gone soft with age and green with moss, but still, the full length of the building, still carrying the memory of the feet that had crossed it for 26 years, of mornings and evenings. Beyond the platform, the rail bed ran away into the trees in a long straight line. The ties and rails pulled up 60 years ago, but the ballast still showing in patches, where the leaves had not covered it, a scar in the earth that remembered what it had been. Leonard Fenwick said, "You need help with that bag." "No, sir," Nora said. "Thank you for the ride." He nodded once. He said, "Dorothea will come back in 2 days. There's a hand pump for the well around back. Water's cold, but it's clean." He waited until she had stepped out of the truck and closed the door before he turned around and drove back down the dirt road through the bare hardwood. She stood and listened to the sound of the engine until it was gone, and then she stood in the silence that followed it. The silence was complete. Not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street. The silence of a place that had been waiting a long time for something to happen in it. The kind of silence that has weight and texture that you can feel against the skin of your face, the way you feel cold air from an open window. She could hear the river somewhere below the ridge, a low, continuous sound like the building's own breathing. She walked across the clearing to the platform. Dorothea had given her the padlock key at the township office, a heavy brass key on a wire ring that had the look of something that had been hanging on a hook for decades without being needed. Nora fitted it into the padlock on the waiting room door and felt the mechanism turn with the slow resistance of something that had not moved in a long time, and then the hasp swung free and she pulled the door open and stepped inside. The smell reached her before anything else. Cold cinder and old paper, and the faint, sweet smell of pine boards that had been sealed against the weather for a long time, and underneath all of it, something else. Something she could not name. Immediately, the accumulated presence of a place where people had waited and hoped and arrived and departed for a quarter century and then stopped. She stood still for a moment and let her eyes adjust to the dimness. The waiting room was a single long space with a slate floor scuffed smooth by decades of feet, dark wainscoted walls rising to whitewashed plaster above the chair rail, and a wooden bench running the full length of the right-hand wall, worn to a shine at the center, where generations of travelers had sat with their luggage at their feet and their eyes on the door. At the far left corner stood a pot-bellied iron stove, cold and dark now, but still solid on its hearth, the kind of stove that a man who knew what he was doing could have running and throwing heat within 20 minutes. And at the far end of the room, set into the wall, directly beneath the bay window, was a closed wooden door. The ticket booth. Nora walked the length of the waiting room slowly. She put her hand on the cold iron of the stove. She put her hand on the back of the wooden bench and felt the smoothness of it, 60 years of hands and coats and the weight of people waiting. She looked at the plaster walls and the wainscoting and the slate floor, and she thought about every person who had stood in this room with a bag in their hand and a destination in their mind every early morning and every winter evening, every arrival and every departure. She put her hand on the brass knob of the ticket booth door. It turned. The door swung inward. The ticket booth was perhaps 6 feet square. A high wooden agent's desk faced the bay window, its surface scored and stained by decades of use, the marks of rubber stamps and spilled ink in the rings left by countless coffee cups. A tall wooden stool stood behind the desk. On the wall above the desk, a row of wooden pigeonholes still held the ghost shapes of the waybills and receipts and timetables that had filled them for 26 years. A small iron safe with a combination dial sat in the corner, too heavy to move and long since emptied. On the wall to the left, a chalkboard, mounted in a wooden frame, still held in letters so faint they were nearly gone the last entry anyone had ever written on it. 6:42 p.m. eastbound. Final. Nora stood looking at those words for a long time. Then she crossed to the stool and sat down behind the agent's desk and looked out through the bay window at the empty rail bed. The window was filmed with 60 years of dust, and the boards that had covered it on the outside had warped slightly, letting in thin lines of gray winter light that fell across the desk in a pattern of pale bars. Through the clouded glass, she could see the platform, and, beyond it, the long straight scar of the old roadbed running away into the bare trees. She sat there for a long time without moving. She thought about her grandfather Frank, who had written these lines in 1953 and 1954 on temporary assignment to the Bedford Division, who had stood on platforms very much like this one in weather, very much like this, who had carried the same watch in his breast pocket and kept it set to railroad time because a railroad man should always know what time it is. She thought about how close these things were to each other. The watch, the platform, the ghost writing on the chalkboard, the particular silence of a place that has been patient for a very long time. She thought about Verna saying, "He talked about Whitlock Junction, said the station agent there made the best coffee on the whole division." She slid off the stool. She looked at the floor. The boards in the ticket booth were old pine, the same as the rest of the building, worn smooth and gray with age. But the boards directly beneath the stool, a section perhaps 18 inches square, were a slightly different color than the surrounding floor. Darker. Not dramatically darker, not the difference you would notice walking past, but the difference you would notice if you were sitting on that stool, looking down at your feet, and had the kind of attention to detail that came from growing up in a family that believed in noticing things. The color difference was consistent with boards that had been replaced at some point and had aged differently from the original floor. Aged in a sealed space, perhaps. Aged without the light and air that the rest of the floor had been exposed to for 60 years. Nora crouched down and ran her fingertips along the seam where the darker boards met the lighter ones. She felt the seam. Then she felt at one end of the section a gap. A deliberate gap, smooth cut on both sides, the kind of gap that did not happen by accident or by age, but was made by a man with a fine saw and a reason for making it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the section of floor. Then she stood up and went out through the waiting room to the freight room. The freight room was the larger space, at the left end of the building, the part where the roof had partially failed. A section of the ceiling in the northwest corner had come down, and the floor beneath it was black with weather damage, and the winter sky showed through the gap. But the rest of the freight room was intact, the heavy plank floor solid underfoot, the walls still carrying the iron hooks and wooden brackets that had held freight in transit for 26 years. On the floor near the freight door, half covered by fallen plaster, was a length of flat iron that might once have been part of a switch mechanism or a loading bracket. Nora picked it up and tested its weight and went back to the ticket booth. She worked the flat iron into the gap at the end of the darker section of the floor and applied careful, steady pressure. The section came up, not with a crack or a splinter. It came up cleanly, pivoting on a pair of leather hinges at the far end. Hinges that had hardened with age and stiffness, but had not rotted, had not failed, had done exactly what they were made to do. 65 years after the last time anyone had asked them to do it. The section swung up and back and rested against the leg of the agent's desk. Underneath was a space, perhaps 8 inches deep, fitted precisely into the cavity between two floor joists, lined on the bottom with a piece of oilcloth that had gone stiff and dark with age. Lying on the oilcloth were 3 things: a tin lock box, the kind of small fireproof box a station agent might use to secure the day's cash receipts before the night train. It was perhaps 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, painted dark green, and it was heavy when Nora lifted it, heavy in a way that suggested it had not been left empty. A sealed envelope, thick cream paper, the ink on the front faded to pale brown but still legible, addressed in a careful, slanted hand to whoever finds this, and a folded American flag. Nora lifted each item out and set them on the agent's desk in the thin winter light coming through the filmed bay window. She set the lockbox on the left. She set the envelope in the center. She set the flag on the right. She looked at them for a moment. The flag was folded in the triangular military fold, tight and precise. The kind of fold that is taught to people who understand that how you treat a thing is a statement about what you believe the thing is worth. The stars, visible on the folded face, were 48, not 50. 48, which placed the folding before August of 1959, when Hawaii became the 50th state and the 48-star flag was retired. Someone had folded this flag before 1959, and it had not been unfolded since. Nora opened the lockbox first. The latch was stiff but not locked. She worked it open and lifted the lid. Inside, arranged in neat rows, as carefully as the flag had been folded, were bundled banknotes. Old-style United States currency. The larger format bills from the 30s and 40s, mixed with the smaller post-war issues from the late 40s and early 50s. 20s in a paper-banded bundle. 50s in another. A small stack of hundreds held together with a clip that had left a rust stain on the outermost bill. She counted, slowly moving each bundle to the desk as she finished with it. The total was $9,320. Beneath the bills in the bottom of the box was a small leather pouch drawn closed with a cord. She opened it and poured the contents carefully onto the oilcloth. 11 silver dollars. Each one wrapped individually in a square of tissue paper that had gone translucent with age. And one more thing. A pocket watch. A Hamilton 992B in a silver hunting case, the standard timepiece issued to Pennsylvania Railroad, agents and conductors identical in make and model to the watch her grandfather had carried for 32 years. She set it on the desk beside the money. She looked at it for a moment. 2 Hamilton watches separated by 65 years, sitting on the same desk in the same 6-foot room in the Allegheny foothills. She picked up the envelope. The paper was heavy stock, the kind used for official correspondence before the war. The seal on the back flap had dried and cracked with age. Nora worked it open carefully, trying not to damage the paper, and drew out 4 folded sheets. She unfolded them and read. The handwriting was small and precise, and deeply confident, the hand of a man who had spent 30 years filling out waybills and manifests and timetables in triplicate, and had developed through that labor a script that was both efficient and oddly beautiful. Every letter formed completely, every line straight without the aid of ruling. It said, "To whoever finds this, my name is Harlan Odell. I have been the station agent at Whitlock Junction on the Bedford branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad from the spring of 1932 until today, the 17th of June, 1958. The branch line is being closed at the end of this week. The last passenger train will run on Friday evening at 6:42. After that, the rails will be pulled up and the building will be locked, and there will be no reason for anyone to come here again. I am 64 years old, and I have no children. My wife, Eleanor, passed in the spring of 1949. I have one sister in Altoona, whom I see at Christmas. I have spent 26 years at this small junction watching trains come in from Bedford in the morning and go out toward Pittsburgh at night. And I have known every regular passenger by name, and I have made a pot of coffee every morning at 5 o'clock for the brakemen and engineers on the through freights, even though the making of coffee was not part of my contracted duties. I considered it my duty anyway. A small kindness on a cold morning is sometimes the difference between a good day and a hard one, and I saw no reason to withhold it just because no one had put it in writing. I have saved a portion of every paycheck I ever drew, working this station, 26 years of portions, in this lockbox beneath the floor of the booth where I have sat every working day of my adult life. I do not trust banks. I lost what little I had to the failure of a savings institution in Bedford in 1933, and I did not care to repeat the experience. The money has been safer here than it would have been anywhere else. This booth has been my responsibility, and I have taken that responsibility seriously. The silver dollars belong to Eleanor's family. Her father collected them. She kept them in a cedar box in the bedroom, and I have kept them since she passed. They should go to whoever finds this, along with everything else. The Hamilton watch was issued to me by the railroad in 1934. I am leaving it behind because I do not want to carry railroad time after Friday. After Friday, I will be a private citizen, and private citizens set their watches by whatever standard pleases them. The railroad's time has been my time for 26 years, and I am leaving it here where it belongs. If you are reading this letter, you came into this depot after I am gone, perhaps long after. Perhaps the building has stood empty for years, and the clearing has grown up around it, and you found it by accident or by following the old roadbed, or by some other path I cannot anticipate. Whatever brought you here, I want you to know that this depot has been waiting for you. A small station is a patient thing. It waits for the train, and then it waits for the next train, and then eventually, when there are no more trains, it waits for whoever will come next. I have been the one waiting at Whitlock Junction since 1932. I am leaving the waiting to you now. Take what is in this box. Every dollar and every coin. It is for you. I have no one else to leave it to, and I would rather it go to someone who needs it than sit under this floor until the building falls down. The flag belonged to Eleanor's brother, Thomas Garvey, who was a brakeman on the Erie Railroad and was killed in a coupling accident in the Hornell Yards in November of 1944. He was 31 years old. Eleanor folded the flag herself the day the railroad sent it back with his things. Keep it folded the way she folded it. Be kind to the building. The roof over the freight room needs attention. The well behind the north wall is sound. The pot-bellied stove in the waiting room draws well if the flue is cleaned. The coffee here tastes better than anywhere else on the division. I have never been able to determine why. I have stopped trying to find out and simply accepted it as one of the facts of this particular place. Harlan Odell Station, Agent Whitlock Junction, June 17th, 1958. Nora read the letter twice. The second time she read it more slowly, pausing at certain lines and going back to them. A small station is a patient thing. It waits for the train, and then it waits for the next train, and then eventually, when there are no more trains, it waits for whoever will come next. She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and returned it to its envelope and placed the envelope in the inside pocket of her pea coat next to her own heart, next to the place where she had carried Frank's letter for the last 8 years. She sat for a long time on the stool behind the agent's desk, with the money and the coins and the Hamilton watch and the folded flag arranged before her in the thin winter light. She said out loud to the empty room, and to whoever might still be present in it, in the way that people who have spent their lives in a place are sometimes still present in it after they are gone. Thank you, Mr. Odell. I will try. Dorothea Fenwick came back 2 days later, as promised, in the green truck with Leonard driving. She found Nora on the platform with a broom she had found in the freight room, sweeping 60 years of dead leaves and grit from the platform boards. She had the pot-bellied stove going inside. The smoke, rising from the brick chimney, was the first smoke that chimney had produced since 1958. And it rose straight up in the cold, still air above the clearing, as if it had been waiting for the occasion. Dorothea got out of the truck and looked at the smoke, and then looked at Nora and said, "You found it then?" Nora stopped sweeping. Dorothea said Harlan Odell was my husband's great uncle. She said it simply the way she said most things without fanfare, as if this were information she had been carrying for the right moment. I've known about the lockbox my whole life. Harlan told my husband's grandmother about it before he left for Altoona. She told my husband's mother. By the time it got to Leonard, it was just a family story. She paused. We never opened it, she said. Harlan was clear in the telling of it. It was for whoever came to the depot and bought it and opened it themselves. He was particular about that. He said it had to be someone who chose the place, not someone who already knew what was in it. She looked at Nora steadily. We've been waiting for someone to come along and pay the $10 for 30 years. Nora thought about this for a moment. She said, "Why didn't you tell me before I signed the deed?" Dorothea said, "Because then it would have been about the money." She walked past Nora to the waiting room door and looked inside at the stove burning in the corner and the swept slate floor and the open ticket booth at the far end. She said Leonard can help you with the freight room roof when the weather breaks. He's got lumber. That was the beginning of it. The rebuilding was slow and patient, the way all real things are built. Nora spent the money the way her grandfather would have spent money that had been saved in small, careful increments for 26 years. She did not spend it recklessly. She did not spend it on comfort or on anything that could not be justified by necessity. She opened an account at a credit union in Bedford and deposited the $9,320 and drew on it in amounts that she tracked in a small pocket notebook, recording every expenditure the way Harlan Odell had recorded every train in the station log. Cedar shingles for the freight room roof, roofing tar, glazing compound for the bay window, a second-hand kerosene cook stove from an estate sale in Bedford, a proper mattress, a wool blanket, 2 pairs of work gloves, a claw hammer, a handsaw, a box of galvanized nails. She learned to shingle a roof by watching instructional videos on the library computer in Bedford, then by going home to the depot and making mistakes and correcting them. The first section she shingled, she had to pull up and redo because she had not started from the bottom course correctly. She pulled it up without complaint and started over the way her grandfather would have done, without drama, without cursing the wasted work, simply accepting that some things require doing twice before you understand how to do them once. Cal Briggs found her on a Saturday morning in her 3rd week. He was a retired carpenter from the township, 70 years old, with hands that looked like tools themselves, broad and scored and precise. He drove up the dirt road in a rusted Dodge pickup and got out and stood looking at the depot for a moment, and then looked at the section of new shingles on the freight room roof and walked up to where Nora was working and looked at it more closely. He said, "Your starter course is running high on the left." Nora looked at it. He said, "Get down from there. I'll show you." Cal Briggs came back 3 more Saturdays after that. He brought his own tools. He showed her how to set a door so that it hung plumb and swung clean. He showed her how to reglaze a window sash. He showed her how to clean a flue with a brush on a flexible rod, working from the top down, shaking the creosote loose and collecting it at the base of the chimney. He refused to accept any payment. He said the work was its own payment, which Nora understood was not a modest thing for a man who had spent 50 years doing that work to say. Merritt Langford arrived on a Thursday afternoon in the 4th week. He was 68, a retired Conrail engineer from a small property 4 miles east of the township. He had heard from Dorothea that someone was reopening the Whitlock Depot, and he drove out with a wooden crate in the bed of his truck and carried it to the platform and set it down and looked at Nora and said, "These belong here more than they belong in my attic." Inside the crate, 4 Pennsylvania Railroad timetables from the 1940s and 1950s, a brass conductor's lantern oil type, the railroad's initials stamped into the base, 2 PRR porcelain mugs, white with the Keystone logo in red, the kind issued to station agents and dining car staff, a section of original rail, perhaps 2 feet long, with the date 1928 and the Carnegie Steel mark stamped into the web. Nora set the lantern on the agent's desk in the ticket booth. She set the mugs on the window shelf. She hung the timetables on the waiting room wall with small brass tacks. She placed the section of rail on the platform beside the door where passengers had once stood waiting. Merritt Langford came back every other Sunday after that without announcement and sat on the platform bench with a cup of coffee and talked about the old line. He talked about the grades and the curves and the particular way the Bedford branch behaved in winter when the ice built up on the switches overnight. He talked about the difference between a freight engineer's job and a passenger engineer's job, which he summarized as the difference between being responsible for cargo and being responsible for people, and said both were serious, but only one of them kept you up at night when you made an error. He talked about the men he had worked with for 30 years, many of them gone now, and the way a crew that had worked together long enough developed a kind of wordless coordination that he had never found in any other kind of work. He never talked about Harlan Odell. He hadn't known him. The line had been closed 14 years before Merritt started his career. But he talked about the men who had known the line when it ran, and in that way, Harlan Odell was present in the conversations even without being named. Nora had begun making coffee. It was not a business decision. It was not a strategy. It was simply the thing that felt right in that particular place, the same way it had felt right to Harlan Odell for 26 years at 5 o'clock in the morning. She kept a kettle on the pot-bellied stove from 7 in the morning until the stove went cold in the evening, and she set a row of mismatched mugs on the shelf above the bay window. And when anyone came down the old rail bed, which happened more often than she had expected, she offered them a cup. The rail bed had become a walking trail over the decades. Hikers and birders and railroad history enthusiasts and the occasional weekender from Pittsburgh who had seen a reference to the old Bedford branch in a magazine. They came in ones and twos and small groups, and most of them walked past without stopping. But some stopped. A retired school teacher from Bedford, who had been walking the rail bed for 20 years and had always wondered about the building, a father and his teenage son who were documenting abandoned railroad infrastructure across Pennsylvania for a website. A birder who had been coming to this particular section of the Allegheny foothills every spring for a decade and had never seen the building occupied. They came in and looked at the Hamilton watch on the agent's desk and the timetables on the wall and the section of 1928 rail on the platform And they drank coffee from mismatched mugs, and they left small things on the bench inside the door: a jar of local honey, a loaf of bread from a bakery in Bedford, a handful of early wildflowers in a glass jar, a folded $5 bill tucked into the tin Nora had set on the bench without quite intending to. By the end of spring, Whitlock Junction was a place where people stopped on purpose. Merritt Langford brought her a hand-painted wooden sign for the platform. One Sunday, the letters in the same style as the original station signage: Whitlock JCT Coffee. He had made it himself in his workshop. He said it was not much. It was exactly right. Dorothea Fenwick brought a string of small white lights to hang along the eaves for the evenings, which Nora strung on the first warm Saturday in May, and which made the platform look on a clear evening like a place that knew it was worth seeing. Cal Briggs built her a new platform bench from reclaimed white oak, salvaged from a barn demolition in the next valley over. He built it in the proportion of the original waiting room bench, inside wide and solid, and designed for people who intended to sit on it for more than a few minutes. He set it on the platform facing the rail bed and said, "Now people can wait properly." By early summer, the freight room roof was tight against rain. The bay window held new glass. The pot-bellied stove burned clean through the flue Cal had cleared. The waiting room had a freshly swept slate floor and new curtains that Dorothea had sewn for the bay window from a blue-gray cotton that matched the color of the winter sky over the foothills. Nora had made a bedroom for herself in the freight room: an iron cot, the wool blanket, a shelf made from 2 planks, and a pair of brackets Cal had installed. On the shelf, she placed the framed photograph of her father in his Conrail jacket, and she placed her grandfather's silver pocket watch on its leather cord, and she placed a single PRR porcelain mug that she used for her own morning coffee. The Hamilton 992B she kept on the agent's desk in the ticket booth, wound and set to railroad time the way Harlan would have kept it. She was beginning to understand something about this place. Not just about the building, but about the particular quality of attention it required and rewarded. Harlan Odell had spent 26 years in the 6-foot booth, looking out at a rail bed and serving coffee to people he was not required to serve. And the result of that attention and that quiet generosity was a building that felt, even after 60 years of emptiness, like a place where someone had been genuinely present. She was beginning to understand that presence was something you built, the way you built a roof or hung a door, through the accumulation of small, deliberate acts performed consistently over time, and that the building recognized this the way all buildings recognize the quality of attention they have been given. The coffee, she noticed, was exceptional. She could not explain it. She used the same coffee she had used at Verna's. The water from the hand pump behind the north wall, cold and tasting faintly of iron and stone. The same technique, but the coffee at Whitlock Junction tasted better than coffee made anywhere else she had ever made it. She remembered Harlan's letter. The coffee here tastes better than anywhere else on the division. I have never been able to determine why. She stopped trying to determine why. She simply accepted it as one of the facts of this particular place, the way Harlan had, and made the coffee in the morning and kept the kettle warm on the stove and let the fact stand on its own. It was in the 3rd month on a Monday afternoon, when the railbed was quiet and the summer light was long and golden on the platform boards, that Dorothea Fenwick drove up the dirt road in the green truck with a different expression on her face than Nora had seen on her before. Not bad news exactly. Not the expression of someone bringing a tragedy, but the expression of someone who has been carrying a difficult thing for a few days and has arrived at the moment when it has to be put down. She parked and came to the platform and sat down on Cal's bench without being invited, which told Nora something about the weight of what she was carrying. She accepted the cup of coffee Nora brought her. She held it in both hands. She said, "There's something you need to know about." Nora sat down on the far end of the bench. Dorothea said, "A development company out of Pittsburgh filed a proposal with the county board 3 weeks ago. They want to acquire the full corridor of the old Bedford branch, rail bed from Bedford to the county line, about 14 miles. Their proposal is to develop it as a private resort and trail system." She paused. "Whitlock Junction sits in the middle of that corridor," she said. Nora was quiet. Dorothea said their attorney sent a letter to the county board last week arguing that your deed may not be valid. Their position is that the depot sits on county land that was never properly conveyed to private ownership when the railroad surrendered its right-of-way in 1961. They're saying the township didn't have the legal authority to sell it to you for $10 or to sell it at all because the underlying land title question was never resolved. She looked at Nora over the rim of her coffee cup. She said, "The county board has 60 days to respond to the challenge. If they don't respond, or if the board finds the argument persuasive, they can move to vacate your deed and transfer the property to the development company as part of the corridor acquisition." Nora looked at the rail bed running away into the trees. She thought about Harlan Odell, who had sat in that booth for 26 years and had locked the door for the last time in June of 1958 and had left $9,000 and a letter under the floor for someone he had never met and would never know. She thought about her grandfather, Frank, who had carried a pocket watch in his breast pocket for 32 years and had set it to railroad time every morning because a railroad man should always know what time it is. She thought about the coffee getting cold in her hand. She said, "What do we do?" Dorothea Fenwick looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been a township clerk for 19 years and has spent those 19 years watching people come up against problems that seem larger than them. She said, "We go through the records, every deed, every survey, every right-of-way document, every county board resolution from 1958 to the present. If there's something in the paperwork that settles the question, I'll find it." She paused. She said Harlan Odell was a meticulous man. He was an agent for 26 years. He filed every document this station ever generated. If he thought there was something worth protecting, he would have found the proper way to protect it. She set her coffee cup down on the bench. She said, "I think we need to look very carefully at what Harlan filed in 1957. The county records room was in the basement of the Harlan County Courthouse in Bedford, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of old paper and the particular dry cold of a room that had never been properly heated. Metal shelving ran floor to ceiling along 3 walls, each shelf loaded with cardboard boxes and bound ledgers and flat file drawers labeled in the careful hand of whoever had been responsible for the records at the time they were filed. Dorothea Fenwick had been coming to this room for 19 years. She knew it the way she knew the township office, and her own kitchen knew where things were kept, and how they were organized, and which filing systems had been maintained consistently, and which had been allowed to drift into a comfortable disorder that made sense only to the person who had created it. She moved through the room with the quiet efficiency of someone for whom records were not bureaucratic abstractions, but living documents. The paper memory of decisions made by real people in real circumstances that still had consequences decades later. Nora sat at the single table in the center of the room and watched. Dorothea pulled boxes. She opened ledgers. She ran her finger down columns of entries with her reading glasses pushed up close to her face and made small sounds of assessment. Not yet, and not this one, and there, that one. Setting aside the volumes that were relevant and returning the rest to their shelves with the practiced motion of someone who did not waste movements. They had been there for 3 hours, when Dorothea stopped. She was standing at the flat file drawer at the far end of the room, the one labeled Harlan County Property, Miscellaneous Filings, 1950 to 1960. She had the drawer open and was working through the folders inside, and she stopped with one folder open in her hands and stood very still for a moment. Nora looked up from the survey map she had been examining. Dorothea said, "Come here." Nora crossed the room and stood beside her. The folder was labeled in a hand Nora recognized from the letter, Whitlock Junction Depot, Heritage Designation Application. H. Odell, filed March 14th, 1957. Dorothea opened the folder on the flat file surface, and they stood together looking at the document inside. It was 4 pages typed on heavy bond paper on a manual typewriter, the keys striking unevenly in the way of all manual typewriters, some letters slightly darker than others. At the top of the first page, centered and underlined, Application for Designation of Railroad Heritage. Property pursuant to Harlan County. Ordinance 14C adopted. 1908. Dorothea said quietly, "I didn't know this ordinance was still on the books in 1957. She read. Nora read beside her. The ordinance adopted in 1908 during the period of rapid railroad expansion in central Pennsylvania had been intended to protect historic railroad infrastructure from hasty demolition during periods of corporate restructuring. It allowed any citizen with a documented connection to a railroad property to petition the county for a heritage designation that would require a supermajority vote of the full county board before the property could be sold, demolished, or transferred to any entity other than its current lawful occupant. Harlan Odell had filed the application in March of 1957, 15 months before the Bedford branch closed, 15 months before he locked the door for the last time and drove away from Whitlock Junction for the last time. The application was thorough. It documented the depot's construction date of 1887. It described the building's continuous operation as a staffed passenger and freight station for 70 years. It included a hand-drawn survey of the building's footprint and the surrounding cleared land with measurements and compass bearings. It cited the ordinance number and the specific provisions that applied. And at the bottom of the 4th page, in the careful slanted hand, Nora now knew was a note in ink. Handwritten added after the typed text, "This application is filed in anticipation of the line's closure, which I understand to be forthcoming. I am filing it now while I am still the lawful agent of this property, so that whoever comes after me will have the protection of the law, whether or not they know to look for it. The building should outlast the railroad. Buildings that have served people honestly deserve that much." The county clerk's stamp at the bottom of the page showed that the application had been received, reviewed, and approved on April 2nd, 1957. The approval notation was brief. Designation granted. Property entered into County Heritage Register. C. Register Volume 7, page 214. Dorothea closed the folder. She said, "He knew." Nora said, "He knew the line was closing." He knew more than that, Dorothea said. She looked at the folder in her hands. He knew that when the line closed, the legal status of the property would become ambiguous, that there would eventually be a question about who owned the land under the building. That question might take 10 years to arise, or 50 years or more. But he knew it would arise. And he filed this so that when it did, the answer would be in the record. She paused. She said, "Under Ordinance 14. See, this designation means the development company's argument doesn't hold. The heritage designation creates a protected category that supersedes the right-of-way question. The county can't transfer this property without a supermajority vote, 7 of 9 board members. And even if they achieve that vote, the current lawful occupant has the right of first refusal and 60 days to match any offer. She looked at Nora. She said they would need 7 votes to take this away from you. I know this county board. They won't get 7 votes. Nora stood looking at the folder for a long moment. She thought about Harlan Odell, sitting at the agent's desk in March of 1957, 15 months before the last train, typing this application on a manual typewriter in the small ticket booth in the Allegheny foothills. Knowing the line was dying, knowing the building would stand empty, knowing that the legal ground under the building was uncertain, and that the uncertainty would eventually attract the wrong kind of attention. Filing the papers anyway, quietly, without telling anyone, locking it into the county record the way he had locked the money into the floor of the booth, with patience and precision, and the absolute conviction that the right person would eventually come and the right person would need it to be there. She said he protected it before he left. Dorothea said he protected it for whoever came next. He just didn't know how long the wait would be. The county board meeting was on the 3rd Thursday of the following month. Nora sat at the long table in the boardroom of the Harlan County Courthouse with Dorothea Finnick on her left and Cal Briggs on her right. Merritt Langford sat in the row of chairs behind her. He had driven in from his property that morning without being asked. He had put on a pressed shirt for the occasion, which Nora understood was a significant thing for Merritt Langford to do. The development company's attorney was a man in his 40s from Pittsburgh in a dark suit that was too formal for the room and communicated without intending to, that its wearer did not think much of the room. He presented his argument with the polished efficiency of someone who had made similar arguments in many rooms and expected them to succeed. He cited the right-of-way statute. He cited the 1961 rail abandonment filing. He said the county had no authority to convey title to a property whose underlying land ownership had never been legally resolved. He did not know about Ordinance 14C. Dorothea presented the heritage designation application when the attorney finished. She set a certified copy of the original filing on the table in front of each board member. She explained the ordinance calmly and without dramatic emphasis, the way she explained everything as if the facts were sufficient, and they were. The attorney asked for a recess. He came back 20 minutes later and asked the board for additional time to review the new information. The board chair, a woman in her 60s named Patricia Danner, who had been on the county board for 11 years and had the particular patience of someone who had heard every kind of argument made about every kind of property dispute in a rural Pennsylvania county and was rarely surprised anymore, looked at the attorney and said, "You have 2 weeks." 2 weeks later, the development company withdrew its proposal. The board voted 6-0 on the heritage designation with 3 abstentions. The designation stood. Whitlock Junction was on the County Heritage Register. It had been on the County Heritage Register since April 2nd, 1957, and it would remain there. The attorney drove back to Pittsburgh. Nora sat on Cal's platform bench in the evening light after everyone had gone and held the pocket watch in her hand and said nothing for a long time. Verna Kowalczyk had driven down from Scranton the week before the board meeting, arriving on a Thursday afternoon with her car loaded in the way of a woman who intended to be useful and had packed accordingly. A box of kitchen supplies, a bag of her own clothes, a folding cot she had used before. A paper bag that proved when Nora opened it that evening to contain 6 jars of her house-made tomato preserves and a tin of the butter cookies she made at Christmas, and apparently also at other times when the situation warranted them. She stood on the platform and looked at the building for a long moment. She said, "He did good work." Nora was not sure if she meant Harlan Odell, or Frank Callahan, or Cal Briggs, or some composite of all the men whose hands had been on this building in one way or another. She said it as if the distinction did not entirely matter. She stayed for 3 days. She helped Nora paint the inside of the ticket booth the color of fresh cream, a shade that made the small space feel larger and warmer and more like a room where a person could reasonably spend a working life. She rehung the timetables on the waiting room wall with better placement, standing back and tilting her head until they were level in a way that satisfied her. She reorganized the shelf above the bay window, moving the mugs to the left so there was a clear space on the right for a small vase of whatever was blooming outside, which in late summer was goldenrod and late yarrow, and a dark centered flower Nora did not know the name of. On the second evening, they sat together in the ticket booth after the last walkers had gone from the rail bed. Verna on the wooden stool behind the agent's desk, and Nora on a second-hand chair she had placed in the corner, and they drank coffee from the PRR porcelain mugs as the light went out of the sky over the western ridge. The Hamilton 992B ticked on the desk between them. Verna looked at it for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something about your grandfather." Nora looked at her. Verna said Frank Callahan sat in the third stool from the left at my counter every Saturday morning for 19 years. From 1962, when I opened the diner, until 1981, when he retired. Eggs, over easy, rye toast, black coffee, no variation. He was there when I opened the door at 6, and he was gone by 7:30. 19 years of Saturday mornings without a single exception that I can remember. She paused. She said he didn't talk a great deal. Frank was not a man who talked for the sake of talking. But sometimes, maybe once a month, he would say something at the counter that was worth hearing. The kind of thing a man says when he has been thinking about it for a while and has finally decided it is worth the words. She held the mug in both hands, the way she always held it. She said, in the fall of 1965, maybe October, he told me about a morning in 1953. He was on temporary assignment to the Bedford branch, the way I told you. He had been on a through freight that came down from Altoona overnight, a run that got into Whitlock Junction just before 5 in the morning in the middle of November. He said it was cold enough that the breath of the engine was still showing when they got down from the cab, that kind of Pennsylvania cold that gets into the iron of everything. She paused. She said, he said the station agent at Whitlock was a man named Harlan Odell. He described him the way you describe someone you remember clearly. Slight man wore a gray cardigan over his work shirt, had a way of moving around that small booth like he knew every inch of it. Frank said Harlan had a pot of coffee going on the stove in the waiting room, and he brought it out to the platform for the crew without being asked. Didn't say much, didn't make a show of it, just brought the coffee out and set it down and went back inside. Verna looked at the Hamilton on the desk. She said Frank told me that cup of coffee on that cold morning in November of 1953 was the kindest thing a stranger had ever done for him. Not the coffee itself, he said. The not being asked, the fact that Harlan Odell had decided on his own, for his own reasons, that the crew on the overnight freight deserved a hot cup of coffee at 5 in the morning and had provided it without requiring any acknowledgement or gratitude or explanation. Frank said there was a particular kind of generosity in doing a thing like that quietly, without making the recipient feel that they were receiving charity. He said he had thought about it many times over the years. She set her mug down on the desk. She said, he never forgot that man Nora. In 40 years of Saturdays, he mentioned Harlan Odell 3 or 4 times. Not many, but always with the same quality of attention. The way you mentioned something that went into you and stayed. She looked at Nora across the small space of the ticket booth. She said, And now you're sitting in that man's chair, in that man's station, pouring that man's coffee for the people who come down the rail bed. The room was very quiet. The Hamilton ticked on the desk. Nora looked at the watch for a long moment. Then she looked at her grandfather's silver watch on its leather cord, where she had set it beside the Hamilton that evening. The two watches lying side by side on the desk in the lamplight. The same make and model, the same railroad time. 65 years and the width of a kitchen counter apart. She thought about the overnight freight coming into Whitlock Junction at 5 in the morning in November of 1953. The engine breathing in the cold. Frank Callahan coming down from the cab with frostbitten hands and the long night behind him. Harlan Odell bringing the coffee out without a word. She thought about Frank carrying that moment for 40 years, setting it down at Verna's counter in October of 1965, because it had been worth the words. She thought about Harlan in March of 1957, typing 4 pages on a manual typewriter in this small booth protecting the building for whoever came next, the way you protect something you believe in, even when you cannot see the person it is being protected for. She thought about the particular patience of that. She said, he served the coffee, and Frank remembered it, and 40 years later, Frank told you, and you remembered it, and now I'm here. Verna said, that's how it works. That's always how it works. The kindness doesn't disappear. It just travels in ways you can't track. She stood up from the stool and picked up the mugs. She said, I'm going to wash these and go to bed. Board meeting tomorrow. She said it the way she said most important things without ceremony, as if the enormity of the moment was best honored by continuing to function normally within it. At the door of the ticket booth, she stopped. She said Frank would be proud. Danny would be proud. She paused. You are a Callahan in the only way that matters. She went to wash the mugs, and Nora sat alone in the ticket booth with the 2 watches on the desk and the lamplight on the cream-colored walls and the long silence of the foothills coming in through the filmed glass of the bay window. And for the first time since the cold February evening, when she had stood in the alley behind the row house with a cardboard box in her arms and read a note in her mother's handwriting, Nora Callahan allowed herself to cry. Not from grief, or not only from grief. From the accumulated weight of everything that had led to this particular chair in this particular room, and from the understanding arriving slowly, and then all at once the way understanding arrives, that she was not at the end of something, but in the middle of something that had been going on for a very long time without her, that had been waiting for her to arrive and take her place in it. She cried quietly and without apology, the way her grandfather would have approved of, and then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and wound both watches and set them to railroad time and went to bed. Ruth came on a Saturday in early October. Nora did not know she was coming. There had been no call, no letter, no message of any kind. The first indication was the sound of a car on the dirt road, and Nora looked up from the platform where she was restacking a pile of slate that had come loose from the path edge and saw her mother's car pulling into the clearing. Ruth got out alone. She stood beside the car for a moment, looking at the building, taking in the new shingles on the freight room roof, and the glazed bay window and the platform bench, and the sign Merritt had made, Whitlock JCT Coffee, and the string of small white lights along the eaves that would come on at dusk. She looked at all of it with an expression Nora could not entirely read, something between recognition and the particular complicated grief of someone seeing for the first time what they almost prevented from existing. She walked across the clearing and stopped at the edge of the platform. Gary was not with her. Nora noted this without comment. Ruth looked at Nora. Nora looked at her mother. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Ruth reached into her jacket pocket and took out something small and held it out across the platform rail. It was a photograph. Nora recognized it before she had fully processed what she was looking at. A 4x6 print, slightly faded at the edges, showing a man in a Conrail maintenance jacket standing beside a section of track on a winter morning, squinting slightly into the light. One hand on a rail spike maul, the other at his side. Her father, Danny Callahan. In the winter of some year, she could not precisely identify looking exactly the way she remembered him looking when he came home in the evenings with grease on his hands and the diesel smell in his hair. She had believed this photograph lost. Gary's purge of the row house had been thorough, and she had assumed it was gone. She took the photograph from her mother's hand. Ruth said, "I found it in a box in the basement last spring. I kept meaning to send it. I didn't know how to send it." She did not say anything else. She did not offer an explanation for the note on the door, or the locked house, or the 2 years of silence that had followed. She stood on the edge of the platform and looked at the depot with the expression of someone who understood that certain debts cannot be paid in full, and was not going to pretend otherwise. Nora looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then she said, "You want coffee?" Ruth was quiet for a beat. She said yes. "Please." They sat at the table Nora had put together from 2 sawhorses and a plank inside the waiting room across from each other in the gray October light coming through the curtained windows, with PRR porcelain mugs and the pot-bellied stove going in the corner. The waiting room smelled of wood smoke and coffee and old pine and the particular accumulated warmth of a place that had been lived in with care. They did not speak about the note or the locked doors. There was no apology offered and none demanded. Nora was not ready to receive an apology, and she suspected her mother was not yet ready to give one, not in the full and adequate form that the situation required, and she had come to understand in the months she had spent in this building that some things needed the same patience the building itself required. You could not rush a roof. You could not rush a door. You could not hang something true on a frame that was not yet square. What they talked about instead was Danny. Ruth talked about him the way she rarely had since his death. The way people talk about someone when they are finally far enough from the worst of the grief to approach the person and not only the absence. She talked about how he had driven her to the county fair in Lackawanna in the first summer they were together, and had spent 40 minutes trying to win her a stuffed animal at a ring toss game before she finally told him she didn't want the stuffed animal, she wanted to ride the Ferris wheel. She talked about the way he had laughed at that, a full surprise laugh that she said she had fallen in love with on the spot. Nora had not heard these stories before. There was a version of her father in them that was younger than the father she remembered, a version that existed before her in the years when he was simply a young man in Scranton who had not yet walked out of an insurance office and had not yet carried the pocket watch across the kitchen table or taught his daughter the names of freight cars. She held these stories carefully the way she had held the photograph in the tight. They sat for 2 hours. When Ruth stood to go, she paused at the waiting room door and looked back at the ticket booth and the timetables on the wall and the lantern on the shelf. She said, "He would have come here, you know. Your father. He would have driven out here on a Saturday morning just to see it." Nora thought that was probably true. Ruth left. Nora stood on the platform and watched the car go back down the dirt road through the bare hardwood and disappear at the first curve. She did not know what came next between herself and her mother. She did not know if Gary Pruitt would always be part of the picture, or if he would eventually recede the way certain things recede when they are no longer useful to the person who chose them. She did not know if the particular cold that had filled the row house for 6 years could ever be fully aired out, or if the relationship between her and Ruth would always carry the mark of those locked doors, the way a piece of wood carries the mark of a knot present and visible, and something you worked around rather than through. She knew only that her mother had come alone on a Saturday morning with a photograph in her jacket pocket, and that they had sat together for 2 hours and talked about her father, and that this was more than there had been the day before. Sometimes that is how the distances close. Not all at once, and not with ceremony. One cup of coffee at a time. The autumn came down slowly over the Allegheny foothills, the hardwood ridges going through their full, deliberate sequence of color, the maples first, and then the oaks, and then the last stubborn beeches, holding their copper leaves into November. The light changed the way it changes in the Pennsylvania mountains, losing its summer sharpness and going golden, and then amber, and then the particular gray gold of late fall that makes every surface look slightly historic. The railbed walkers thinned out as the weather cooled, but they did not stop entirely. There were the regular ones, the serious hikers, and the habitual birders, and the dedicated railroad enthusiasts who came out regardless of weather. And there were the occasional new ones, people who had heard about the coffee from someone who had walked the trail in summer and had decided to come see for themselves. Merritt Langford came every other Sunday without variation through the heat of summer and into the cool of autumn and sat on Cal's bench with his coffee and talked about the old line. He had begun bringing photographs, old prints from his collection, some of them going back to the 40s and 50s, showing the Bedford branch in operation. Trains at grade crossings, station platforms with passengers waiting. Freight consists moving through the mountain cuts. He would hand them to Nora one at a time and talk about each one, the locomotive class, the freight consist, the location, the approximate year. She listened to all of it and began to understand, through his telling, the full shape of what the line had been and what its closing had meant to the communities that had depended on it. Cal Briggs came back twice more in the autumn with small projects he had identified without being asked. A set of new brackets for the freight room shelf. A piece of trim he had noticed was loose above the waiting room door. He worked without conversation and left when the work was done, and the work was always better than it needed to be, because Cal Briggs did not know how to do work that was only adequate. On an evening in late October, Nora sat alone on the platform bench as the sun went down behind the western ridge. She had both watches in her hands, her grandfather's silver Hamilton on its leather cord in her left hand, Harlan Odell's Hamilton 992B in her right. She held them up side by side in the last of the light. Both watches showed the same time. The minute hands were aligned exactly, the second hands moving together in the same steady sweep. Railroad time kept faithfully by two men who had never met each other, and two women who had never met each other, and a cup of coffee on a cold platform in November of 1953 that had carried something forward through 65 years without losing it. She thought about her grandfather Frank, who had ridden cabooses through every kind of Pennsylvania weather for 32 years and had never once been late to work, because he understood that punctuality was a form of respect for the people depending on you to be where you said you would be. She thought about her father Danny, who had walked out of an insurance office on a Monday morning because the coat felt like somebody else's and had gone back to the only work that had ever felt like his own, and who had taught her that the most honest things in the world were the ones that did not pretend to be something other than what they were. She thought about Harlan Odell, who had served coffee at 5 in the morning to men on overnight freights because he had decided on his own that it was the right thing to do, and who had typed 4 pages in March of 1957 to protect a building for a person he would never know, and who had hidden everything he had earned in 30 years under the floor of his ticket booth and addressed it to whoever finds this, with the absolute patience of a man who believed that patience always arrived somewhere eventually. She thought about Verna Kowalczyk, who had listened without interrupting for 4 hours on a winter evening and had turned the open sign to closed and put eggs on the stove, and who had driven 3 hours down from Scranton on a Thursday afternoon because someone she cared about needed another person in the room. She thought about Dorothea Finnick, who had known about the lockbox for years and had said nothing because she understood that some things had to be found in the right way by the right person. She thought about Cal Briggs, who showed up with his own tools and refused payment because he understood that certain kinds of help are diminished by the transaction of payment. She thought about Merritt Langford, who pressed his shirt for a county board meeting and sat in the row behind her and did not say anything but was there. She thought about all the small, honest things that had been set down by careful hands and patient hearts and left to wait for the moment they were needed. A station is a patient thing. That was what Harlan had written, and she had come in the months of working and listening and making coffee for strangers on a platform in the Allegheny foothills to understand what he had meant by it. Not just about the building, not just about the particular quality of stillness that this clearing had maintained through 60 years of emptiness, about the way that certain kinds of goodness operate in the world quietly and without fanfare, leaving what they have to leave in places where it can be found by whoever needs it on whatever morning the finding becomes necessary. Her grandfather had carried a pocket watch for 32 years and had kept it set to railroad time because knowing the time was a form of respect for other people. Harlan Odell had kept the same kind of watch set to the same time for the same reason. They had never met. They had exchanged nothing but one cup of coffee on a November platform in 1953, and that exchange had traveled forward through the decades through Frank's memory, and Verna's telling, and Nora's arriving on a winter morning with $10 and a canvas duffel until it had arrived here at this bench at this evening with these two watches keeping the same time in the same failing light. She wound both watches. She set them both to railroad time, checking them against the radio clock she kept in the waiting room, adjusting the minute hands to the exact second. She held them side by side one more time. Then she put her grandfather's watch back on its leather cord around her neck where it belonged, where it had always belonged. She carried Harlan's Hamilton inside and set it back on the agent's desk where it had sat every working day of his adult life, where she wound it every morning and set it every morning and let it run through the day, marking the time of a railroad that no longer ran on these rails, but that still ran in some way she could not fully articulate through this building and through the people who had loved it. She put the kettle on the stove. She made a cup of coffee. She carried it outside and set it on the platform step in the spot where the overnight freight crews had stood on cold mornings to receive what Harlan Odell had brought them without being asked. She set it down carefully and stepped back. It was a small thing. Nobody saw it. The railbed was empty and the clearing was quiet, and the only light was the string of small white lights along the eaves and the last gray gold light above the western ridge. But small things done honestly, in the right place at the right time for the right reason, are not diminished by the absence of an audience. Harlan Odell had understood that for 26 years. Frank Callahan had understood it for 32. Verna Kowalczyk had understood it for 40. Nora was 20 years old. She was learning. She went back inside and stood in the doorway of the ticket booth and looked at the Hamilton on the desk, and the two PRR mugs on the shelf, and the timetables on the wall, and the long settled quiet of a room that had been waited in with honesty and patience for a very long time. She thought about Harlan's last line. The coffee here tastes better than anywhere else on the division. I have never been able to determine why. She understood it now. It tasted better because of what had been poured into this place over 26 years of mornings. The attention and the patience and the small unrequired kindnesses that accumulate in a space the way warmth accumulates in a stone slowly and without drama until the stone holds the heat long after the source of it is gone. The building was full of it. You could feel it when you walked in. The walkers on the rail bed felt it without knowing why they felt it. The coffee carried it. The silence carried it. The particular quality of waiting that this place had always done and was still doing carried it. A small station does not stop being a station just because the trains have stopped running. It keeps the schedule in its bones. It keeps the coffee in its kettle. It keeps the lockbox under the floor of the booth, and the flag folded in its triangular fold, and the Hamilton wound on the desk, and all the small, honest things that the last person who loved it set down before they turned the key in the lock. It waits. That is what a station is. That is what Harlan Odell was for 26 years in this small booth in the Allegheny foothills, watching the trains come in from Bedford and go out toward Pittsburgh, and making the coffee and keeping the time and protecting the building with 4 typed pages and a county ordinance from 1908 before he drove away for the last time in June of 1958. Harlan Odell had waited for Nora Callahan for 65 years without knowing her name. Frank Callahan had waited for her in the shape of a silver pocket watch on a leather cord and a letter in a drawer and 32 years of keeping honest time. Danny Callahan had waited for her in the smell of diesel and the names of freight cars and the understanding that some coats belong to other people and you have to find your own. Verna Kowalczyk had waited for her in the back booth of a diner in Scranton with a fresh pot of coffee and the willingness to listen without interrupting. Dorothea Fenwick and Cal Briggs and Merritt Langford had been waiting for her too, each in their own quiet Pennsylvania way for the young woman who would walk 4 miles down a county road in February cold and sign her name in her grandfather's slanted hand and put a kettle on a stove that had not been lit in 60 years. Nora Callahan was 20 years old. She had $10 to her name, and she had spent it on an abandoned train station in the Allegheny foothills of central Pennsylvania. It was the best $10 she ever spent.